What would you do if you were publicly humiliated for something you rightfully owned? Imagine settling into your first-class airplane seat, a luxury you worked hard for. That was the reality for David, a calm and successful architect. But his peace was shattered when an arrogant passenger stood over him, demanding he'd get out of the seat. "You don't belong here," the man sneered. "Flight attendants will move you to the back." The flight attendant arrived, and without even checking the tickets, she sided with the aggressor, telling David to move to avoid causing a scene. The entire cabin was staring. He was being judged, humiliated, and treated like a criminal. He could have given up. He could have accepted the injustice. But they made one critical mistake. They had no idea who David really was. And he was about to make a phone call that would not only clear his name, but would turn the tables so dramatically that the captain himself would have to step in. Stay tuned to see how one man's quiet confidence led to the most satisfying karma you'll ever witness at 30,000 feet. The low, comforting hum of the Boeing 777's engines was a symphony of success to David Carter. For him, every flight wasn't just a journey. It was a victory lap. He leaned back into the plush leather of Seat 2A, the fabric cool against his neck. The crisp scent of clean linen and a hint of champagne from a passenger across the aisle filled the exclusive air of the first-class cabin. This was his sanctuary at 30,000 feet, a world he had built for himself, one architectural blueprint at a time. David had grown up in a neighborhood where the roar of a plane overhead was a reminder of a world you could only dream of. Now he designed the skyscrapers that reshaped those skylines, and the planes carried him to meetings in cities that were once just names on a map. This flight from New York to San Francisco was particularly important. He was on his way to sign a contract for the biggest project of his career, a state-of-the-art sustainable tower that would become the new jewel of the city's architecture. He had earned this seat, this moment of peace. He closed his eyes, a small, satisfied smile gracing his lips. The calm, however, was about to be shattered. "Excuse me, you're in my seat?" The voice was sharp, cutting through the cabin's serene murmur like a shard of glass. David opened his eyes. Standing over him was a man in his late 50s, with a florid face and a suit that was expensive but poorly fitted, as if his tailor was afraid of him. He carried an air of belligerent entitlement, his briefcase held like a weapon. David offered a polite, neutral smile. "I don't believe so. I'm in 2A. "And I'm in 2A, the man snapped, thrusting his boarding pass forward, though not close enough for David to actually read it, "so I suggest you move now." His eyes flickered over David's casual but expensive attire, cashmere sweater, and dark jeans, with a dismissive sneer. The unspoken message was clear. You don't belong here. David's internal calm, forged in countless boardrooms facing down skeptical investors, held firm. He'd faced this brand of casual prejudice his entire life. It was exhausting, but he had learned long ago that meeting aggression with aggression was a losing game. Grace was his weapon of choice. "Sir, there might be a misunderstanding," David said, his voice even and smooth. "I'm happy to look at your pass. Here's mine." He held up his own boarding pass, the bold, to a clearly visible. The man, who David would later learn was a mid-level executive named Frank Harrison, didn't even glance at it. "I don't need to see your pass. I know where my seat is. What do you people think you can just sit wherever you want?" The phrase "you people" hung in the air, thick and poisonous. The cabin, which had been a low hum of private conversations, fell silent. Heads turned. Eyes stared. David felt the familiar heat of a dozen pairs of eyes on him, the sole black man in the first-class cabin, suddenly on trial. "Sir, I'm not going to argue with you," David said, his politeness now a shield. "Let's just call a flight attendant and get this sorted out." "Fine by me," Harrison scoffed, already flagging down a passing crew member with an impatient wave. "Maybe they can find you a more appropriate seat in the back." A flight attendant with a name tag that read Susan approached. She had a practiced plastic smile, but it faltered slightly as she took in the scene. She looked from Harrison's red, indignant face to David's calm, dark one, and in a split second, she made a calculation. She made a choice. "Is there a problem here, sir?" she asked, directing her question and her smile entirely to Harrison. "Yes, there's a problem," Harrison boomed, pointing a thick finger at David. "This man is in my seat and he's refusing to move." Susan's gaze finally fell on David, her expression now a mixture of impatience and condescension. "Sir," she began, her tone suggesting she was speaking to a disobedient child, "we need to get the cabin ready for departure. If you could please move to your assigned seat, we can all get on our way." "My assigned seat is this one," David stated, holding up his boarding pass again. "Seat 2A. I would appreciate it if you would simply verify both of our tickets." Susan's smile tightened. It was clear she saw David not as a first-class passenger with a legitimate claim, but as a problem to be managed. "Sir, I'm sure it's just a simple mistake. Why don't you let me see your ticket, and we'll find where you're supposed to be." The emphasis was subtle, but the insult was loud and clear. She took his pass and gave it a cursory glance, her eyes barely registering the information before turning back to him. "Sometimes the gate scanner makes a mistake. Mr. Harrison is a frequent flyer with us. I'm sure he knows his seat. Avoid any further disruption. I'm going to have to ask you to move." Disbelief washed over David. It was a cold, familiar wave. She hadn't even looked. She hadn't checked Harrison's ticket. She'd simply sided with the loud, aggressive white man over the calm black one. The injustice of it was breathtaking. "With all due respect," David said, his voice dropping to a lower, more serious register, "you haven't done your job. Your job is to verify the tickets. You have not verified his ticket. I paid for this seat. This is my seat, and I am not moving until you follow proper procedure." The other passengers were now openly staring. An older woman in 3B looked uncomfortable, while a young man in 1A had his phone out, though he wasn't overtly recording. Harrison puffed out his chest, sensing victory. "You hear that? He's refusing to cooperate. Get security. Get him off this plane." Susan's face hardened. Her professional mask slipped, revealing a flash of genuine anger. "Sir, if you don't cooperate, I will have no choice but to call the captain. I can assure you he will not be pleased with this delay." A slow smile spread across David's face. It was a genuine one this time, though it held no warmth for Susan or Harrison. It was the smile of a man who knew the game was about to change. "The captain?" David said, leaning back in his seat as if he didn't have a care in the world. "You know what? That's an excellent idea. Oh, please, by all means, call the captain." Suzanne was taken aback. This wasn't the reaction she expected. She had anticipated fear, submission, a reluctant retreat. Not this confident invitation. Flustered and angry, she spun on her heel. "Fine, I will." As she marched toward the cockpit, Harrison leaned over David, whispering menacingly, "Big mistake, buddy. You're going to be escorted off this plane in handcuffs." David simply looked out the window at the bustling tarmac, a picture of unshakable tranquility. He knew something that no one else in the cabin did. He was waiting. A few minutes later, Susan returned, a tall, uniformed man with silvering temples and an authoritative presence following her. This was Captain Miller. He had the calm, steady eyes of a man who had seen everything and was impressed by nothing. "Susan, what is this I hear about a passenger refusing to take his seat?" The captain's voice was deep and commanded immediate respect. The cabin fell completely silent. "Captain," Susan said, pointing at David, "this passenger in 2A is refusing to move. The seat belongs to Mr. Harrison, and he is causing a significant delay." Captain Miller's eyes followed her pointed finger. He looked at David, who was now looking back at him. The captain's professional, stern expression froze. His eyes widened slightly. A look of disbelief, then recognition, then sheer unadulterated delight washed over his face. "Dave," the captain exclaimed, a booming laugh suddenly filling the tense cabin. "David Carter? What on earth are you doing on my flight?" He strode forward, bypassing a stunned Susan and a slack-jawed Harrison, and clapped David warmly on the shoulder. "I haven't seen you since that reunion in San Diego. How have you been, you old dog?" David chuckled, the sound rich and easy. "Doing good, Mike. Doing real good. On my way to close a big deal, actually. I see you're still flying these big birds. Someone has to." Captain Mike Miller laughed. "But what's all this about you being in the wrong seat? Don't tell me the Air Force's best navigator can't find his way to his own chair." The shift in the cabin's atmosphere was seismic. It was as if a switch had been flipped, flooding the room with a new, blinding light. Susan's face had gone from red with anger to a ghostly white. Harrison looked like he had been punched in the gut. "Well, Mike," David said, his tone light but with an underlying edge of steel, "that's what this gentleman and your flight attendant have been trying to convince me of." Captain Miller's smile vanished. He turned, his friendly demeanor replaced by a professional chill that was far more intimidating than his anger. He looked at Susan. "Give me both boarding passes," he said. It was not a request. Susan fumbled for the tickets, her hands trembling slightly. She handed them over. The captain looked at David's. "David Carter, seat 2A. He then looked at Harrison's. "Frank Harrison, seat 6B. He held up Harrison's pass. "Sir, your seat is 4 rows back. You are the one causing this disturbance." Harrison stammered, his face a mottled mess of red and white. "But," she said, ... I thought, ... He thought wrong. The captain cut him off. He then turned his cold gaze to Susan. "And you? What is your name?" "Susan, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Susan," the captain said, his voice dangerously quiet. "My flight crew is trained to de-escalate situations by following simple, basic procedure. The first step of which is to verify the travel documents of both parties. You failed to do that. Instead, you chose to believe one passenger over another without evidence, and in doing so, you harassed a paying customer and escalated this situation unnecessarily. We will be having a formal discussion about your future with this airline as soon as we land." Suzanne looked like she might faint. She could only nod, her eyes wide with terror. Finally, the captain turned back to Harrison. "Sir, you have publicly berated another passenger and caused a delay. Under FAA regulations, I have the authority to have you removed from my aircraft. So here are your choices. You can take your assigned seat in 6B and not say another word for the entire 5-hour flight, or you can collect your belongings and be escorted off this plane by airport security right now. Choice is yours." Humiliation radiated from Harrison in waves. Every eye in the cabin was on him, watching, judging. Without a word, he snatched his briefcase, turned, and shuffled down the aisle to row 6. His face burning with the shame he had so eagerly tried to inflict on another. Captain Miller turned back to David, his warm smile returning instantly. "Sorry about that, Dave. Can I get you a drink before we take off on the house?" "I think I'll be just fine now, Mike," David said with a grateful nod. "Thank you." As the captain returned to the cockpit and a new, far more respectful flight attendant took over Susan's duties, the plane finally pushed back from the gate. The woman in 3B leaned over. "I am so sorry I didn't say anything," she whispered. "That was incredible to watch. You handled that with such class." David simply smiled and nodded. As the plane soared into the sky, he looked out the window at the world shrinking below. The incident had left a bitter taste, a familiar sting of prejudice. But it was overshadowed by the quiet, profound satisfaction of justice served. He had earned his place in the world, and today, at 30,000 feet, he had refused to let anyone, no matter how loud or ignorant, take it away from him. He leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes, and for the second time that day felt the pure, unadulterated taste of victory.